Welcome to the AI and Faith podcast. We are a community of expert technologists, professionals, and faith leaders bringing the ancient wisdom of the world's major religions to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Join us on this new journey and welcome to the conversation.
We need to be thinking about ethics in terms of solving problems. Once again, the beauty of literature, you can raise those questions and not answer them. And some people look at ethics that way. I know some ethicists who say, hey, I just raise questions, you have to answer them. And that's partly, I think, what ethics teaching is about. We want to teach people how to make their own decisions. We don't want to just tell people what to do. That's not the right way to do it. You want to empower people to have the resources that they need to make their own good decisions.
My name is Elias Kruger, and I will be your host for today. Today's episode is an interview with two contributors to our recently published anthology, Faithful AI, Stories of Hope from 2045. In his short story, Julian Dreiman explores the struggle an indigenous man goes through to find community in a futuristic, AI-saturated Chilean society. Brian Greene responds to the story with an essay on how technology is changing human relationships. Listen now to our exciting conversation. Hello. So today here we have Julian Dreiman and Brian Greene. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, we're excited today to talk about both the story and the essay that Brian wrote in response to the story. Maybe we'll start a little bit with Julian. Can you give us a short overview of the story now, of course, without any spoilers, but just a general sense of the plot of the story that you wrote for the Faithful AI book?
Yeah, of course. So the story starts in the near future in 2037 in the south of Chile on a Mapuche reserve. And Mapuche are the indigenous folks who live in Chile. And the story follows Vicente, who is coming of age when the story starts. And through some natural disaster and calamity, he ends up leaving his community in the south of Chile and migrating to Santiago, where he, without a community, faces some struggles. And he meets folks along the way who try and help him find that community. And eventually it brings him to a meeting at the Church of Latter-day Saints in Santiago, where he interacts with some different types of people at the church who want to help him find community in the LDS group, but he's not sure if he wants that. And so the story follows his kind of internal dialogue as well as external dialogue with other people, trying to discern what is the right community for him to join.
Fantastic. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit like what inspired you to write? I'm assuming you're not from Chile, and I don't think you're Mormon, but yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm not from Chile, from the US. I'm Jewish, in fact, but I did live in Chile for 6 months, and it was a pretty impactful time in my life. And while there, I saw a lot of people on their missions from the LDS Church, both in the South, which is a lot more rural, but also in Santiago. And on my daily bike commute to work, I was going to the Jesuit University there on study abroad. On my daily bike commute, I would pass the LDS church, and it really had this stark contrast, which I write about in the story, where the church had this beautiful garden and it's this, gleaming white building, but Santiago itself is pretty polluted and gray, in fact. And so it really stuck out to me. And so when I heard about this contest, actually, Brian told me about it, which was great. And so I thought, what is a connection to religion that is outside of my own experience that I'm excited to talk about? And so I thought about this, my experience of being in Chile, seeing these LDS missionaries. I think it's interesting to think about technology from the non-typical user, or perhaps even people who don't use the technology but are still affected by technology. And so that's what inspired me to start thinking about Vicente and someone who is indigenous and didn't grow up kind of inundated around digital technology like so many of us are. And tying it in with the theme of artificial intelligence, this is obviously a technology that pervades everything in life. And even if you don't want to be interacting with AI now in today's world, even in places like Chile, where may not be considered as technologically advanced as, say, San Francisco, where I'm from, you interact with AI. So I just thought it could be an interesting story that could tease out some nuance by combining an indigenous person in South America thinking about religion, thinking about AI, and bring out some new insights that maybe couldn't be thought of through a more like traditional story or a story that I was more comfortable with telling.
Absolutely. And that definitely came through to the story. There's one thing about it that I thought was interesting is you explore a bit in the story about the contrast between direct and digital digitally mediated relationships, right? As on a phone through Zoom, as we're doing right now, or different things, and then face to face. And of course, AI is part of that, and like augmentation of that. And then you have this indigenous, main character. So tell us a little bit more about kind of how you approach it, especially from an indigenous perspective.
So from my personal experience, I finished my university during COVID. So I had this pretty formative time in my life, was heavily digitally mediated. And so that shaped a lot of my thinking about how I wanted to spend time and how I see the importance of in-person physical relationships. And then in relation to the Mapuche people, what I learned in Chile was that they're a very tight-knit community who was and continue to still be isolated from the rest of Chilean society. And so it really kind of forms this tight-knit group. And also, I do want to add that I'm not a scholar of Mapuche history or anything in that regard. So everything I say is my own personal experience. And so combining that idea that I knew of the Mapuche people of being, a very tight-knit community, and then having my own experience of really seeing the importance and value of face-to-face relationships. When I started writing the story and thinking about religion and how religious groups relate to each other, my personal opinion is that face-to-face, in-person human connection is so important to what it means to be a religious person and what it means to be in community with others. And I also, just from being a scholar of technology, working in the technology sector, seeing how digitally mediated technology was impacting and coming integrated into more and more of our lives, I personally felt that religion is an area of life that should not be digitally mediated. And obviously in certain situations, for example, like during Zoom, when church groups or synagogues were able to meet online and maintain that community, it worked really well. But when we're not in one of those kind of precarious situations, it seems to me that religion is best when it's in person, when it's physical, when it's face to face. And there's the, small anecdote in the story where Vicente meets the college student who's coming and going, and he ends up selling him a sweatshirt. And this college student is kind of grappling with this lack of physical relationship that he has, or rather the difficulty of having or creating physical relationships. And I think that when we use digital technology and we rely on it so heavily, we can lose, or rather be de-skilled from the things that or experiences that we used to think of as normal. For example, having a face-to-face conversation or being with people physically. So I guess those kind of three different ideas of my personal experience with digital technology, my ideas about religion that's digitally mediated, and then also my experience knowing people who are Mapuche in the relationships that they have with each other, all combined to put Vicente where he was in the story when he's having that final conversation with Brigham and questioning if it makes sense to have this intimate personal conversation with a digitally mediated artificial intelligence.
Thank you, Julian. Let's switch to Brian. A little bit about physicality and presence. So I wonder how, especially specific on this story, how do you think that the Mormon church navigates this interaction or this thin line between physicality and presence? And is this a model for other religions?
So this is it's an interesting question in the story, and I don't want to give too many spoilers for it. So I'll see if I can put this forward in kind of concrete and yet abstract enough terms so that it's not a spoiler. At one point, he meets the Mormon missionary in this story, and they share food together, for example. And this direct connection, it's like you can't eat in a virtual environment. It doesn't work that way. You can't eat virtual food. So in this case, it's one of the reasons I think that churches have communion as a component of what their church is. There's the coming together of the community, but there's also we all need to eat together. This is a meal that we're sharing. So I think that physical element to it is really, really there. And it's important. It's important. We're embodied creatures. We need to be present for each other. The direction the story goes at one point is to have an encounter with an artificial intelligence. And of course, the artificial intelligence is kind of present in a room, but it's also, of course, not really there. And this raises all sorts of questions about the human mind. We're kind of ready to relate to these sorts of entities that are not the same as we are. But at the same time, we kind of have to ask ourselves, what's been lost exactly in this interaction? What's different about this relationship? What kind of threads do we want to pull on in order to figure out more theologically or philosophically what's important about being embodied and what's maybe important about not being embodied? What do we lose when we change from one environment to the other? Is a virtual environment only a loss? Is there some sort of enhancement to it that also comes along with it? There are all sorts of different questions there.
No, and kind of diving more into this, I want to quote two things you wrote that was so well written. I have to like basically quote you here. So the first you said, "This is the freedom of literature to raise questions and not answer them," which is, the story really doesn't answer the question. But then you go on to say, "Every real ethical question has a deadline because the goal of ethics is good action." Can you expound a little bit on that for us?
Sometimes ethics is presented as a very theoretical kind of philosophy. It's like, are we going to follow Kantian deontology or John Stuart Mill's utilitarian calculus or virtue ethics from Aristotle and all those sorts of things? And that's kind of the theoretical background behind ethics. But ultimately, ethics comes down to you have a decision that you have to make. There's a choice that you're being presented with. Do I do X or do I do Y or some other option? Because very often we tend to just reduce things to two options, but there are a lot more than two options in most cases. And so then ethics really has to help you. Is it helping you actually come to a conclusion there? You don't want to have ethics that's not useful, I guess would be kind of one way of describing it. Some people have created ethical systems that humans basically can't use. Some people have made that as a critique of utilitarianism, for example. It's like, oh, this is a great ethics for computers or predictive algorithms or something where you have to calculate really significantly and you have the data that you need in order to predict the future. And I'm not saying humans can't be utilitarians, because humans certainly can be, but maybe it's not the ideal ethical system for humans to use, or maybe computers are just going to be much better at it than we are. So when we're looking at ethical systems, and people, I should say, just to interrupt myself, people sometimes make that same critique about all sorts of ethical systems. They say, Kantian deontology also not very realistic. It's much too theoretical. How does it actually play out in real life? But the point is that ultimately we need to be thinking about ethics in terms of solving problems. And so once again, the beauty of literature, you can raise those questions and not answer them. And some people look at ethics that way also. I know some ethicists who say, hey, I just raise questions, you have to answer them. And that's partly, I think, what ethics teaching is about. We want to teach people how to make their own decisions. We don't want to just tell people what to do. That's not the right way to do it. You want to empower people to have the resources that they need to make their own good decisions. And maybe that's something that teaching ethics, or the way that teaching ethics is different from actually practicing ethics. But ultimately, ethics has to be practical. It has to be something that we can really use in reality.
Brian, he and I worked together on a fellowship, and the institute that we worked on that together is called the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. So that fellowship was thinking about these things in theory, these big questions, but then at the end of the day, doing work that can have a practical and real impact on the world.
That's exactly right. It's an applied ethics center. There are some ethics centers in the world that are not applied ethics centers. They just think about things more theoretically. But the whole point when the Markkula Center was founded was to think about how do we give people the practical help that they need in order to make ethical decisions in whatever context they find themselves in.
That's great. And I think that's a great framing for our next question. So one of the themes that we're exploring at AI and Faith is this idea of NLPs, large language models, and sacred texts. As you can imagine, as you can already witness, there are Bible chat GPTs, Torah GPTs, you name it. There's religious texts now kind of coming to you through chatbots and other things. The book forces us to look a little bit ahead, which is exactly the purpose of it. So if we think about Brigham, right, which is, again, the name of the AI here that the Mormon Church is using in this story, do you see that as maybe a cautionary tale or maybe something to aspire for, or maybe both? How do you frame that in the sense of this, where we're going with sacred scriptures and NLPs and large language models?
So printing is a type of technology. There's many types of technology that we use every day that are common to us, that are known, and that we've accepted as normal. And so when someone goes to read the Torah, read the Bible, read the Quran, and they're using a printed text, that's a piece of technology. When you read the story, you'll see that Vicente interacts with Brigham in this one-on-one situation. And Vicente really has trouble with that, and he finds fault in this one-on-one interaction. And Brigham counters with this other story saying that, well, there's actually times when one-on-one interaction with a sacred text is important. And so I guess to answer your question of if this is, a cautionary tale or something that we can look forward to, I think it's less about what form the technology takes, be it Bible verse that you interact with through a LLM or a Bible verse that you interact with through printed word, but rather how you interact with that text. And so is it just individual? Is it just by yourself. In some situations, maybe that is what's needed. But in other situations, perhaps it's better to be in community with folks as you interact with those sacred texts. And so it's inevitable. And like you pointed out, we're already seeing that sacred texts are being mediated through these AI technologies, these large language models. Rather than saying if that's right or wrong in and of itself, I think we should be questioning how are they being used and in what settings are they being used. But Brian, I'll pass it back to you. Do you have other thoughts?
This is a really interesting question because you can think about how sacred texts are presented in church. They're read out loud. And one of the things that's meant to be the communication mode for these things, they're written down as kind of a secondary technique. It used to be people would memorize large sections of these sorts of books. And now we've gone towards the written word in the form of a book. But now the culture is kind of turning back to being more oral or video based even. The very idea of a podcast, for example, or of a video on YouTube, we're moving away from kind of a text-based interaction and towards a more human in some ways, but also still technologically mediated. It's not so much about whether it's something to aspire to or a cautionary tale. It's just that we have to think about the difference here. And one of the differences with learning from a podcast or video is that the relationship between the speaker and the hearer is asynchronous, right? You can't have a conversation anymore. But with the AI and the story, you can actually have a conversation. And that's something that AI and large language models have actually, it's one of the things that people find really attractive about them. Now you can have a conversation with a machine. And the machine always has a certain perspective or data set that it's built upon. For example, certain biases will be built into the data set. It might be specifically trained towards a particular kind of scripture, or a particular religion scripture, or a particular translation of the Bible, things like that. I think the thing to do is just to recognize that this is a difference. It opens up new abilities, but it also could lead to some bad things. It could lead to people, no longer talking to friends about the sacred scriptures. You're not in a community anymore. If you have that conversation solely one-on-one with a machine, it's going to be a very different sort of community that you're producing, if you're even producing a community at all.
I want to maybe dwell a little bit on this because I think this is an important point. First, very interesting what you said, that maybe we're turning back to some oral traditions to listening more. And also comes to mind, in antiquity, you have people like Socrates kind of bemoaning this idea of writing because it's like, well, spoken word, there's nothing like it, you can't really capture it. There was the sense that something was being lost, right, when you write something. So now we're shifting away from writing to kind of video and audio, but now we're like to a point where there's really not even need to be a human there anymore. Yeah, what are some losses here that we might have to mourn if that indeed becomes, the direction of things?
One of the reasons that Plato and his character Socrates and I can't remember the name of the dialogue right now, but the one where they're talking about writing, he bemoans the fact that people won't think anymore, right? They'll just read the book, they'll get all their ideas from a book, and then they don't have to think. Actually, we've seen this, right? There are certain types of fundamentalist religions where it's just like you have the book, you don't need to think anymore. So that was a real danger. It's not like they were wrong about that prediction. That's still going to be a risk going forward. The idea that certain fundamentalist religions or fundamentalist groups of people, because it won't necessarily even be traditional religions, you could come up with an entirely new perspective on religion and you just reinforcement learn your LLM towards doing that,
right?
Whatever it might be. And the purpose of it will be to answer all the hard questions for you, make everything easy so that you don't have to think anymore. And anything that it can't answer, it'll say like, oh, don't be a heretic, don't ask questions like that, or come up with some sort of sophistic answer, sophistry that says that, oh, there's not actually a question there, right? It's just you're tricking yourself into thinking there's a question. And I think that the persuasive power of AI is something that we're going to see becoming more and more of an issue in the future. I was just at a conference in these last few days, and a few people there said the thing that really worries them about AI is that it's going to be more persuasive than any human being could ever be, because it will know everything about you. It'll know everything about your context. It'll know your personality, your history. It'll get it from social media or from wherever. I mean, potentially even your text messages. I mean, there are places that information can be gotten about you that you might not expect. But as soon as it's recorded, it's available for that use. And then it's going to turn all of that on you and say, this is how I manipulate you in order to get you to do what I want. And ultimately, then we shouldn't think that the AI is acting on its own. The AI is going to report to somebody, and the AI is going to do what somebody else wants it to do. And that might be mass psychological manipulation of people.
One thing that I think about in my personal faith is that religion in the sacred text, when I look to it, I don't look to it for answers in the text, but I look to it for guidance in my own life. And I fear that with AI, people see AI as a way to make life easier, to free up time, to do something else. But the issue with religion is that it should not be something that's easy or that you seek to get done with so that you can move on to the next more important thing. What's important about religion is that it forces you to have deep thought and take time and consider the pros and cons of a different decision. And so what I fear is that people will become reliant on religious AI technologies to kind of offload some of that difficult work of being a religious person. But that's really the most important part in my mind of being a religious person is having those difficult conversations and sitting with yourself and coming up with your own answer.
Julian, I agree with you completely on that. And that's kind of de-skilling, right? It would be kind of a spiritual de-skilling, the idea that you can offload that thinking to something else, whether it's offloading it to a text and looking in the Bible, and the Bible says this, now I don't need to think about it anymore, or it's offloading it to an AI, and the AI says, oh, you should do this. Then all of a sudden, in a certain way, you've kind of dehumanized yourself. You've turned yourself into something robotic. I mean, if you want to think about it that way, if you're following the instructions of a robot or an AI, you are making yourself into a robot in a certain sense. Just like people say, oh, it's impossible to talk to people who are scriptural fundamentalists or something like that. They always say the same thing, or you can hear complaints about this or imagine complaints about it. In the same way, it's not a book anymore, but it's the book and everything else associated with it put into an AI, which then fills much the same function.
Yeah, when we're thinking about a type of superintelligence, right, where there's almost an omniscience, not perfect one, but really much bigger than any human individual could, then it's almost like we're dealing with godlike powers with the technology. And how do we handle that? I think that's a good question to ask, right? And let's ask this now, not in 2045. Let's start asking these questions now about physicality. I mean, that's the whole point of what this exercise and this book and this publication was about. Let me ask this first to Julian, then I'll ask Brian. But what do you hope readers will take from your story?
First and foremost, I hope that readers in the US and Europe take a global perspective on technology and understand that we have a lot of these discussions in the US and Europe, but that everybody worldwide is facing these same dilemmas, and that people in different countries are going to have different responses to these dilemmas. And so something that we discuss in the US would not be the best response for someone in Chile or someone in Tanzania or someone anywhere else. And then second, I would really want readers to critically examine for themselves the relationship between religion and technology. And like I was saying earlier, religion has always been and always will be in some way technologically mediated because our entire lives are technologically mediated. But it's so important, in my view, to pause. And when we have a moment such as we have right now in society where there's so much change going on, to form a critical and well-informed opinion of what you want to see in the world and then to strive for that world. And, tying this back to our earlier conversation of applied ethics rather than theoretical ethics, it's really important for readers to have these questions that I pose and then don't answer and think about them in relationship to their own lives and then actually come up with an answer for themselves and for them to say, is my church group, is my synagogue relying too heavily on AI as we see it now? Or is my religious group not reaching enough people because we're eschewing these technologies? And so I don't hope to project one answer or another onto these folks, but I really hope that readers can see a new set of questions that will inform how their religious group goes into this new, more AI-mediated future.
What I would say is that I think there's a continuing value of presence, right? Being in person is something that we can't take away, or we shouldn't try to take away. There might be certain circumstances where, if you're going to spread disease to people, then maybe you shouldn't be in person. But and also if we're spread across the country like we are right now, we're in different parts of the country, we have to have a technologically mediated conversation with each other. It's a lot better than not being able to talk at all. But at the same time, we need to recognize, what are we gaining here and what are we losing? We're gaining the ability to converse, which is fantastic, but we're also losing the ability to see, where you are. What's your context like? How's your family doing? To have kind of an extended conversation, to really enjoy being in the presence of another human being. That's something that's getting lost. At the same time, I think we should also recognize that there are positive ways for this technology. Once again, not just because we can actually talk to each other on Zoom, which is fantastic, but think about what we could gain with AI. I talked a lot, just a moment ago about the risks of that, fundamentalism, those sorts of things. You could also imagine designing an AI which just asks you questions, right? It's never going to tell you anything to think. It just says, well, what do you think about that? And how about, how about this idea, or those sorts of things? And of course, that's the way Socratic dialogue works. So the AI could still lead you in places that you don't necessarily want to go, but it could at least make sure that you're doing the thinking to know how you got there. And hopefully it's not going to be negative about it. It could be completely for the sake of, our own education to really build up those thinking skills instead of trying to replace them. And I think this is going to be one of the really big and potentially very, wonderful challenges of the future, is to think about how AI can help us become more human. One of the people at the conference I was just at talked about, let's use AI to reveal humanity instead of replace humanity. And I think that idea of revealing humanity is really important. Actually, the person who said that was a guy named Ryan Green, Ryan Green, not Brian Green. But he made the game called That Dragon Cancer, which is about his son dying of cancer, a virtual reality game. I think that idea of using technology to reveal our humanity is something that we can really focus on. And when we think about religion, let's figure out how to use AI and technology to reveal our humanity as it relates to the subject of religion.
Any final words that you'd like to say about the book or any subjects that we talked about?
It's something that we've touched on several times throughout the conversation, but just to reiterate is that I don't see a world where we don't use technology, where the future is not pressed forward, where we're always adopting something new, something exciting, something better. I just like to say that projects such as this book, the critical thinking that I hope the readers do, can help us better use the technology as it gets pushed forward every day. And tying it back to the idea of applied ethics, it's like, every day we go out and can make choices in the world, and you can choose to make a positive or a negative or a neutral choice. And hopefully having conversations such as these, reading the book, having these critical thinking sessions will help us make better decisions when we have those opportunities every day.
I'll just build on that and say, Elias, this book is fantastic. It's such a great opportunity to think about the future, because a lot of the times we look maybe, what's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen next week or next month? And we don't think about these really long questions about what kind of future are we building together? And we need to use our imagination if we're going to do that. So this opportunity to inhabit a potential future through various different perspectives, the different authors and the stories offer those perspectives. Those are just really important opportunities. And they show us, this future doesn't look too bad. Let's go in that direction. Or this future looks horrible. Let's make sure that does not happen. And I think it's just really important training for our minds also, right? It's something that we can use this technology of storytelling to upskill ourselves in terms of thinking about what the future is going to be like, not de-skill ourselves, but actually get ourselves prepared for this different kind of world that we're moving into and how we want that to look ultimately.
Yeah, I love that. Let's use the technology of storytelling to upskill ourselves for the future to come.
Thank you so much.
You can find Julian's story and Dr. Green's essay in our recently released book, Faithful AI, Stories of Hope from 2045, available now at Amazon. In the meantime, follow and rate our new podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on our social media as well. We are on LinkedIn and X. Thank you for joining us today.